Hello, and welcome to Raising the Bar with the MBBA. I'm your co-host, Adiola Adejobi.
And I'm Jason Clark, president of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. The MBBA is the largest association of predominantly African-American attorneys in New York. Our goal is to advance equality in the pursuit of justice, assist with the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers.
The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation about justice issues in our community and to try to identify a couple of solutions in the process.
Today, we're going to be talking about education transparency for New Yorkers. Joining us today is Ivan Khan, President and CEO of Khan's Tutorial, as well as Joe Rogers, President of Total Equity Now. Great. Hi, Joe. Hi, Ivan.
Thanks so much for having us, guys.
So, this is obviously a very important topic. When we're talking about education and making sure that parents as well as students know their rights. Some of this may be, pretty obvious, but why don't we start with just why it's important to make sure that parents know their education rights of their kids?
Sure. Thanks again for having me. It's good to see you all again. It's really fundamental to any democratic enterprise, to a democracy, for the civic participants, for the citizens to understand what they're entitled to understand their rights, be that for voting rights, be it women's rights, educational rights. We could talk about, police brutality, many of the issues that you all have faced and grapple with here on Raising the Bar. And so educational rights, again, it's important that our students and parents, those who are most directly affected, are fully aware so they can exercise their democratic powers and use that information to hold the government accountable. And then down the line, of course, we treasure education among black and brown folks and just in general because we understand this, it provides us an opportunity to contribute to our families, to our communities, to the broader society in important ways. It allows us, gives us a sense of belonging. And beyond that, it allows us to work with other people to solve complex problems. So if we don't have education, we're not able to contribute and feel that sense of agency. And if we don't know our educational rights, right, we don't have that sense of entitlement, and we don't know how to navigate the system, we're not going to know how to secure the educational opportunities to which we're entitled and that our young people need in order to succeed.
I definitely agree. As a person who works in community spaces around education, we have a chance to work with at least 4,000 students, family members, our instructors on our team at Khan's, and it's very, very apparent how many gaps that currently exist. We'll just start with New York City, for example. I mean, we have 1.1 million students all grouped into one district. And in New York City's entire school system is technically one district, and that's just the way it's set up. So oftentimes we found countless gaps for new immigrant families, black and brown communities, where schools may be missing a notification about important opportunities in the community or in the school system itself. And oftentimes when these opportunities are missed by the school system, parents are left in the dark. So they're not understanding or even aware about the fact that they have the right to certain resources. And when schools miss the beat, we need to make sure there's increased transparency for parents to be empowered, whether it's individual parents or parent groups.
Yeah, and so what are some of the rights that parents have that they often are not aware of?
Sure. So for some of the rights, actually the rights are students' rights in most cases, although parents as the legal guardians or legal caretakers have the right to defend and advance the rights of their children. But one specific right is the right to academic intervention services, which is a fancy title for the additional tutoring and small group support that many of our young people need when they're not meeting state standards in any core academic subject. So under New York state law, our young people, if they're not proficient in math, science, social studies, or English, they have a right to as much additional instructional support as they need, at least to meet state standards. And many of our young people are capable of mastering the content, right? So, but fundamentally, in terms of the legal obligation, they have a right to academic intervention services, which is, in so many of our schools, we have 5%, 10% of our young people who are meeting state standards in English and math, right? Where's that going to get you? So that's one specific example. And another one that the parent leaders with whom I collaborate and from whom I've learned so much stress often when they present to other families in their communities is the right to a school librarian. Right? Under New York State law, it's actually State Education Commissioner's Regulation 91.2. Our young people in every public school have a right to a school library media specialist. And that's a specially trained teacher who's able to help them develop high-quality research skills, find good information, reliable information online, and be able to use that information to solve complex problems.
So what's the status right now? Does each school have a trained librarian?
We didn't set this up. Right? This isn't a plan. This isn't a plan. Great question.
If it's all right.
That's what I was
I'm
gonna
just
say.
curious, like,
All right,
so
yeah.
what's going on?
So I work with, I collaborate with an organization in Harlem called the Harlem Council of Elders. And it's an all volunteer-driven organization led by senior citizens. I'm the only sort of senior citizen in training. We've been waging this campaign to get the DOE, the Department of Education here in New York City, to follow the law. We found, and the DOE confirmed, I don't know if they intended to confirm and sort of give us that to affirm our data, but they confirmed that about 90% of schools in Harlem are violating students' rights to that basic educational resource. And I can tell you, I served as a researcher at Teachers College Columbia University for a while. I went all over the state. I visited many, many schools and talked to many educators. I've never found a single predominantly white school, right, or a middle class, upper middle class school that does not have a school library media specialist, and many of them have more than one. It's not just about taking books on and out, checking books in and out anymore. It's about high quality critical thinking skills, informational literacy skills that help you solve problems and become an excellent college student and maybe a brilliant lawyer, one day.
Yeah, because even as you're talking about it, I feel like there's some information out there showing how there is a connection between, having a librarian and a librarian specialist, and learning the skills that you need to be an active, get an active civic education. When we talk about a lot of the stuff that's going on, people knowing exactly how they can be able to advocate for their own rights. If you don't know exactly about the resources, the things that you learn from a librarian, the things that you learn for these 21st century literacy skills, puts you at a disadvantage.
Yeah, it's huge. Again, let's bring it back to democracy, right? It's about individual advancement, it's about social mobility, but it's really about the health of our democracy. And there's so much information coming at us, for young people, adults included. It's hard to make sense of it. It's hard to figure out what's reliable and what's valid. And so, in a nutshell, that's what school library media specialists, who are required under state law, are there to provide to help our young people sift through, separate the wheat from the chaff, and be able to use reliable, valid information to make their own decisions about how they can contribute.
Yeah, and I want to circle back on academic intervention. Let's say parents realize, oh wait, their child needs additional tutoring. They approach the school says, we don't have the resources for that. Right. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that the schools has enough funding or actually meets this standard in order to provide the academic intervention services?
Yeah, there are five, great question. There are 5 bodies who have a legal obligation to ensure these resources are provided under the state constitution. Those are the governor, the assembly, the Senate, the New York State Board of Regents, the chief policymaking body, and the New York State Education Department. Collectively, they're responsible. SED, the state ed department, the regents don't hold the purse/wallet strings. That's the legislative and executive responsibility. But we have collectively those bodies, and I think we all have a responsibility to document, right, very carefully and transparently, and I hope we'll be able to talk about the bill that's in play now to ensure that we are providing at least the minimum, right? At least the basic services that are required under the law. And I'll just give you a quick anecdote. One of the parent leaders with whom I've collaborated through the Parent Leadership Institute of the Adelaide Sanford Institute, where I serve as a volunteer educational justice advisor, is there was actually a grandparent in this case who, through this year-long workshop series on educational rights, learned that her child or grandchild had a right to academic intervention services, additional tutoring. The child was struggling. The next day, actually it was on a Saturday, so 2 days later, first day back at school, that grandparent went to the principal and said, hey, you know, I just learned my grandchild has a right to these additional supports to help them meet state standards. They're not getting them. What's going on here? And they did it in a very diplomatic fashion, because that's something we worked with the parents, right, to make sure that we understand how to get what we want and how to, you know, present the rights in an effective diplomatic fashion until you need to ratchet it up. Right, and we can do that. We can take it to the streets, but you know there are steps you can take. So the very next day, that principal began providing academic intervention services to that child. Oh, wow. Right? If we don't know, we don't ask. Right. And when we ask, sometimes the wheels start to turn. If a school doesn't now, I'm not saying that that principal started providing AS to all the children in that school, right? We know for sure that the principal said, we're going to provide your grandchild with those services, because that principal knew that grandparent was in the know. Now, what would it take for an entire school of children where 90% of our young people are not meeting state standards in English, for example? The principal may not have the resources. And at that point, it becomes a question of how do you mobilize, you know, politically, how do you escalate the issue? There, you know, as you know, in the system, there's superintendents, there's the, you know, the central, the Department of Education, there's the state education department, and there's so many different tools, and that's why it's important not just to share the information, but to also support parents and young people in using that information effectively to secure the opportunities to which they're entitled.
Right. There's part of me that wonders if the principal was even aware of all of these rights. You know, I mean, principals to administrators, the outcome in all shapes, sizes, and forms. So you can see the school districts where they take these student rights seriously, and you can see the school districts where, whether student underfunding or just the school system turning their backs on particular districts or particular communities, that administrators aren't even aware of all of the rights that their own students have. So I'm looking forward to ways that not only parents are better informed, but school communities as well, from teachers to PTAs to, you know, the front office, like the main office in any school is where I see so much disparity as far as what the main office knows as far as student rights and parent rights. So I can't wait to see a bill like this introduced and pushed and hopefully explored and passed.
I just want to piggyback, if I can, just jump in there, because you said you weren't sure if principals and administrators know these rights, and I think you're right that some who have come in more recently, you know, have this. My colleagues and I in the past started to call it a scarcity framework. Yeah. Right. It's this expectation that you do the best with what you have in hand. You don't ask questions. And if you fall short, well, you did the best, and you should get, you know, some people get sort of a badge of honor for that. These are not bad people. I can tell you through my research, we had confidentiality agreements with these principals and teachers and other school staff. So we go school to school and we say, which of these required opportunities are you providing?
I'm the child of a former AP in Harlem, from grade 7 through 12. So, you know, I know it from that side as well. So it's just like, okay, sorry.
And so really, you know, what they were telling us is we're violating the law. We had a confidentiality. We're an academic institution. I was a researcher at Teachers College, Columbia University. They invited us, welcomed us into their schools, and they did so because these were the good folks, right? They wanted to tell the story, but they couldn't blow the whistle, right? They didn't feel that they had the support they needed from the Department of Education or, you know, the Board of Education, depending on which locality it was. And they said their hearts were broken sometimes. It was like therapy for them. We're violating this law, this law, this law. We're not providing these required services to these children. And they, you know, told us the story so we could tell them on raising the bar, right? So we could push it out, and particularly tell parents and students and community members.
And folks are scared. I mean, educators and school leaders are scared about losing their jobs or not maybe making their tenure track or whatever, you know, job security. That's there. If you're blowing the whistle and telling on the system, you may be placing yourself and your ability to just keep your job at risk. And if that's the worry for, you know, a principal who's a professional, you got to wonder about the worries that Black, Brown, and immigrant communities have, whether it's, you know, engaging the school system because of fears of homeland security and ICE, or understanding that the system has never really been in your favor, from mass incarceration to the school to prison pipeline to many, many, many really tragic events and consequences that are very common to Black and Brown communities. And as a Muslim New Yorker, there's countless areas and moments where our children are being discriminated against on the daily. And folks and parents, even when they know that this is happening to their child, Just this week, I got letters about, just a lot of bullying and just, schools looking the other way. This is a good school in Brooklyn, but teachers are scared to intervene, and it's time that parents have more rights and students.
And even actually to that point, I think it's important to also recognize, which is really the whole topic of today, making sure people know their education rights. But, under the New York State Constitution, every student is entitled to a sound and basic education. And there was a case probably approximately about 10 years ago called the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, where they indicated that there are certain benchmarks that are required of all schools to be able to have. And a lot of those still aren't actually being abided by at this point. But to the point of, I think, this whole conversation is it's about making sure parents and making sure community leaders know exactly what folks are entitled to so people can start to organize for that. So with that said, and we've kind of even started talking a little bit about this potential bill, so why don't we hear a little bit more about this education rights transparency bill that may be able to assist with this type of work.
No, great. Thanks for the question. And you're referring to the Educational Rights Transparency for New York Families Act, which was initially introduced by Assembly Member Walter Mosley a couple of years ago. Still seeking a Senate co-sponsor for the bill, and it seems like it would be a no-brainer for a governor to collaborate with legislative colleagues and get this done. But essentially, it's very simple, and we've already outlined the bill in our conversation here today. It requires that the state implement a system to track access to the required opportunities, and thank you, Jason, for mentioning the Campaign for Fiscal Equity versus the state of New York, a landmark state constitutional case that was waged from 1993, was brought with and on behalf of New York City families initially and had implications for the broader state, was resolved or decided in 2006, so 13 years later. That was 1993. We just, thank God, we made it into the new year. It's 2020. 17 years later, after that case was filed, after parents and families and lawyers and other folks understood that we weren't meeting our constitutional obligation, we're still not providing those opportunities. So this bill, the idea is that for those educators, as you were mentioning, Yvonne, who are worried about blowing the whistle, worried of the repercussions, don't feel that they might be fired, might not make it to the next level in their career, this essentially would be a declaration from the top, right, from our chief legislative leaders that parents and students must know. Not only should they know, it's no longer aspirational, it's they must know. And we need that enshrined in law, because the law should mean something in a democracy, right? We should follow the law, but we also need our leaders to take that courageous step of laying bare and making transparent, in some cases, what they themselves have failed to do or haven't done enough of. And so the bill requires the dissemination of the rights information, right? It requires the sharing of the rights information to students, parents, educators, and other folks. It requires a monitoring or resource accountability mechanism, so a system to track very specifically, and there are 7 categories of rights Jason alluded to under the CFE, or the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit. So at the school level, at the district level, at the state level, there's transparent reporting on to what extent our young people have access year to year to these required opportunities. It's published in user-friendly language. It's fully accessible, right? And that it's not enough to just write it in legalese, write it in policy language, right? You all have JDs. You're a are you a doctor,
yeah,
JD?
Yeah.
Okay, so you got a couple degrees. I have an ed policy degree, but you should never need an advanced degree, even a bachelor's degree or a high school diploma as a young person to understand what you're entitled to. So it's disseminating the information is required through this act. It's monitoring access to the opportunities. And it's also providing an opportunity for those who are directly affected, people in school communities, to report potential violations of their rights as part of this annual convening an annual analysis of what's being provided and what is not, and how do we get there.
For any successful organization, you have to be hyper-focused on the front line. And for the front line, that's the students, that's their parents, and that's the school teachers. We have to ensure that everything that Joe's speaking about in the bill needs to be fully brought to the attention of students, parents, and teachers. So when you know your rights, you can work together to improve, the system as a whole, because the system's broken. So.
Yeah, and even as we're talking about this, I mean, this is very personal for me, because I know that when I was a kid, my mother used to tell me about how in the school I was at that they were under-resourced, and she was worried that myself as well as my sister would start to fall behind. And as a result of that, I was actually had an opportunity to go to another school based on what the state laws were at the time, but they didn't want to let me in. And it was only after the NAACP and Legal Defense and Education Fund, took my case on pro bono and was able to kind of put me in a school that put me on a track to be able to do some of the things I'm able to do. Wow. But I mention that because my mother was knew enough to be able to reach out to like the borough president, reach out to all these other folks, reach out to the LDF. But people shouldn't have to do those things. People should be able to know exactly what their rights are. Or if they're doing so many other things just with general life, there should be some mechanism out there that let folks know, hey, by the way, you're not getting what you're entitled to. Because we're also not talking about a car. We're not talking about, just some type of good. We're talking about people's kids. And what their future holds for that. So that's why, this is so important.
Right, and I would say, and just to add to that, we're also talking about the future of our country, right? It's important that our students have the opportunity to have equal access to education so that they can then turn around and be able to impact their communities. I think when we think about, globalization and everything that's happening in society now, education is key. It's always been key, but it also shows how communities can fall behind if they don't have access to quality education.
Such a simple notion, and you're so right. That's a powerful story you shared about, there are families, and I've talked to many of them who do have the wherewithal. They have the political capital, right? They know somebody, they know something, they know how to navigate the system. They may know their educational rights, or maybe they just feel a sense of entitlement appropriately, right? But there are hundreds of thousands of our families, particularly black and brown folks, particularly those living in poverty, to be very clear, who don't have access to the same information, who don't have the same sense of entitlement. And when I say hundreds of thousands, I'm just talking about here in New York City. Statewide, I've been all over the state. I've been around the country, and I've talked to parents and students, I've talked to educators and state ed department people, and it's the same story. Our families don't know. They're not being given this information. And I just want to, and maybe this was coming down the pike, so I'm anticipating, but I think it's really important, when you say, you may ask yourselves, why wouldn't an elected official take a stand, a courageous stand, and say, look, it's been, we know this is part of the problem, informed citizenry, informed civic participants, make for good government, make for a good society that lives up to our values and principles. And I've talked to some elected officials, I've talked to policymakers, I've talked to young people themselves have sometimes the best analysis. Work with some young people who wrote a play back in 2015 about their educational rights after they learned about them through this workshop series. Blockbuster, 50-minute play, it's on YouTube. It's called 10467. Right? And it was in collaboration with the Epic Theater Ensemble. These are professional actors and playwrights who supported the young people in writing their own play that dramatized not only the day-to-day experiences of young people whose rights have been violated, who are subject to inequities, but also the law. They actually wove in creatively, right, in a way that was very entertaining and engaging, the actual legal requirements. These resource requirements under the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, under the State Ed Commissioner's regulation, under statute. And it's just, I encourage you all to take a look at that if you haven't already seen it. But it's just a testament to, the power of this work, the power of sharing information. And really what it comes down to at the end of the day, why wouldn't someone support the bill, right? What are some of the concerns? Yeah, right, yeah, please, go ahead.
Electeds are beholden to many, many forces. Voters, donors, unions, all of the above. So if what we're talking about ruffles the feathers of any of the previously mentioned, that's directly tied to an elected's ability to get reelected or to grow in their career.
Yeah, there was I remember one conversation with a senior Department of Education official last year This was in collaboration. We sat down. I try not to go to meetings. You know, we don't have a.
Yeah.
You're a parent, so
Yeah,
you fit the bill.
7-year-old and a 5-year-old. Yeah.
It's really important. You know, we had it wasn't just me. You know, as a policy person, Dr. Renee Young, who's the leader of the Parent Leadership Institute of the Adelaide Sanford Institute, was in the room. But it's really the parents who learned of their rights and felt that other families in their communities should have the power of this information, who were making a case to these DOE officials that, look, we want you to share this information. And in fact, under the previous chancellor, there had been a commitment to doing so. And again, we see, you know, foot dragging. We talk equity and excellence, but we see a lot of foot dragging when it comes to really leveling the informational playing field and providing a truly equitable partnership between parents and students and the education system.
So I'm wondering, in terms of nationwide, and this is for the both of you, are you all seeing any similar legislation being put out there or being demanded, or is it that parents just don't realize that these type of opportunities exist, so they're not going after them? And then to the extent that a state may not be as, you know, liberal as New York when it comes to this, what can parents nationwide do to make sure that their governments are also implementing or looking at acts like this to provide more educational transparency?
That official said essentially, you saw the wheels start to turn, and they said, this person said, well, what happens if parents learn and students learn that we're not providing these opportunities? Right? That was like the deal breaker. And that gets to the national scene and the legislative scene and the organizing scene. Again, I mentioned, you know, I've been all across the country, you know, major cities, those with lots of black and brown folks living in poverty. No one's really comprehensively, in a user-friendly fashion, democratizing, I call it, this information and supporting parents in using it. Beyond, there's certain, you know, around disciplinary issues, right? Really critically important. It's sort of siloed work, right? But there really isn't anyone that I've found who's looking comprehensively at the full complement, the full package of rights required under the law, and then looking to support students and parents and holding the government accountable. So there's enormous room. That's something that I'm committed to doing and passionate about doing. And I think we need to connect the dots and work, you know, we need to solve our problems here in New York and then move beyond and connect the dots with other people.
The solutions absolutely have to be collaborative. As he mentioned, Joe mentioned, there's so many silos that's contributing to the problem worsening, and that's added with the fact that oftentimes politics is polarized. In New York City, it can be very polarizing. It can be right or wrong, black or white. It's the far ends. And if we take it to the federal level right now, there's not much confidence that a lot of teachers have in the leadership of the federal, you know, Department of Education right now, currently. So when you mix that in, the folks losing out, unfortunately, are the front line, the students, the parents, and the teachers. So hopefully with conversations like this and raising the bar, and with bills becoming laws, we can hopefully have New York serve as a model on, you know, for later national scalability. So
thank you, Ivan and Joe, for your insight, and thank you for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.